All right, welcome to the video for section 5 of chapter chapter 4, where we will talk about price floors and quantity restrictions. So price floors, again, are minimum prices. Sometimes they are called a support price. Okay, so this is when the government chooses a price floor for a product and then acts to ensure that the price of the product never falls below the support level. One place that these are commonly associated with are for agricultural products. So this is the case with soybeans and corn. Those products have support prices in place for them. Now, just like with ceilings, there are only certain circumstances under which floors will actually matter. In other words, there are only certain circumstances when price floors will be binding. Okay, and this is when they are set above the market clearing price or the equilibrium price, and it ends up resulting in a surplus where quantity supplied is higher than quantity demanded. Okay, so here's an example, right, of an agricultural price support. So the equilibrium price is 8 cents per pound. And the price floor is set at 10 cents per pound. So this would be binding. It would actually have an effect. Price wants to be below 10 cents, but it can't because that's the floor. And it, again, leads to a surplus, right, where quantity supplied is, in this case, 16 billion pounds, and the quantity demanded is 15 billion pounds. Okay, so there's an example of a binding price floor. So this leads us to some questions that we want to answer. How could the government keep the price from falling, number one, and who benefits from the agricultural price supports? Well, one way that the government could keep the price from falling is by basically subsidizing the item, purchasing up the excess supply or the surplus, for example. So that's one way it could do it, or just making it illegal to sell below that price. And then in terms of who benefits, well, the farmers benefit. They get that higher price for their units, but buyers lose out, right? They have to pay a higher price than they would if it was allowed to achieve equilibrium. Okay, so another example of a price floor is minimum wage, right? So hopefully you're familiar with minimum wage, but this is a price floor for labor. Okay, so let's think about that. So here we've got the supply of labor and demand for labor, and an equilibrium wage, WE, and the minimum wage, WM. And again, anytime we have a binding price floor, it leads to a surplus. And what does a surplus mean in terms of the labor market? Well, the surplus of labor is unemployment, right? People that want jobs at that price but can't get them. So they are unemployed. Okay, so this is the classical economic argument against minimum wage, is that it can create unemployment. And again, just like with rent controls, the underlying purpose of minimum wage has a noble cause, right? It's to pay people a higher living wage. But unfortunately, it can have negative effects, increasing unemployment. So, you know, it's good for people who can get the jobs, but for those that cannot get the jobs, it's not really a good thing. And in fact, they may even be willing to work for a lower wage, but because of the legality, they're not able to. Although there are black markets, right? There are plenty of workers who work for less than minimum wage, and it takes place in a black market. Okay, so what are the effects of this minimum wage? Well, it does two things, right? It reduces the quantity demanded, right? So in other words, it reduces the number of job offerings. And then at the same time, it increases the quantity supplied of labor. So the number of people that want jobs at that price. So that's where the surplus of labor is coming from. And again, that leads to unemployment. All right, so another way that the government can sort of get involved, and it leads to similar outcomes as price floors, is through quantity restrictions. And so there are some obvious examples, particularly entirely banning ownership. So a quantity restriction equal to zero. So human organs cannot be traded, drugs, illegal drugs, hospital beds. And as it turns out, you couldn't trade gold between the years 1933 and 1973. So these are all examples of quantity restrictions where the quantity is restricted to zero. But of course, there are illegal black markets for certainly at least drugs. There almost certainly was a black market for gold in those years. And there may even be black markets for human organs and hospital beds to some degree. Okay, so here's a real life example. So dramatic responses to cities' minimum wage hikes, zeroing out unemployment. So a number of cities, including LA, San Francisco, and Seattle, have established a minimum wage rate of $15 per hour, which is higher than the $7.25 per hour federal minimum wage. And so a number of firms and stores reacted to this increase by shutting down. And so here's another problem, right? So some firms and stores were not able to pay employees this much, and as a result, they had to shut down, which means they now supply zero jobs, right? So again, a negative consequence. Another result of these has been the fact that a lot of jobs are being replaced by machines, right? So you may have gone to, I don't know if this isn't happening as much here in Georgia because Georgia hasn't increased its minimum wage, but in places like California, when you go into McDonald's in California, you may find yourself ordering from a machine rather than a cashier. Okay, so again, this is another negative consequence, at least in terms of employment, coming from this increased minimum wage. So those are jobs that used to be performed by people, and people used to get paid for it. Now those jobs are being performed by machines. So these are the kind of problems that minimum wages can cause. No problem. Yeah. Yeah, you're gonna grade all my shit, right?
Grading them.
Check one. All right, and then we're now just going to discuss a couple other ways that quantity restrictions can be imposed. So, government prohibitions and licensing requirements. So, this is where you have commodities that can't be purchased legally at all. So that's government prohibitions. And then also there are other instances where they can only be purchased legally if the seller has a license. One example of this would be doctors, right? Doctors need to be licensed, lawyers. So these are instances where there are basically quantity restrictions. One other example with regard to international trade are import quotas. So this is when supply is restricted and it prohibits the importation of more than a specified quantity of a particular good. So this ends up resulting in very similar effects as price floors. All right, so let's look at one other international policy example. So the European Union decides that the costs of milk quotas outweigh the benefits. So in 1984, the EU established quotas for dairy farmers, resulting in an upward movement along the market demand curve. And despite the higher price received by dairy farmers, they were unable to implement fully new techniques to boost milk production and reduce their costs. And in response, the EU has now completed a phased-in elimination of its dairy quotas. So they saw that the negative effects were not worth the benefits of the quota. Okay, so they ended up eliminating this quota policy. I'm glad that they realized that. All right, so this is pretty much the end of chapter 4. Okay, so let's wrap it up with this one last example here. So here's an example of price rationing price rationing via changes in the number of items sold in a package. So in response to higher costs of inputs used to produce pepper, the spice company McCormick has reduced the amount of pepper in each tin can. And this is basically a practice known as non-functional slack fill. Not something you have to memorize. Don't worry about knowing what non-functional slack fill is, but just FYI. So I actually talked about this with regard to cereal. So this is common among firms that sell food items, right? And it effectively increases the price per ounce in the process, which is rationing via the price system. So it's sort of a way for firms to hide price increases, right? The unit price stays the same, but the amount in that box or tin has gone down, and so the price per unit has actually gone up. All right, so let's go back to middlemen, which we talked about right at the beginning of the chapter. So for a lot of people, the time and effort required to find and choose among all the possible available items is represented by transaction costs, right? So we talked about that towards the beginning of this chapter. Now, consumers wish to reduce transaction costs, and this provides opportunities for middlemen or intermediaries. So a firm called Operator offers digital device apps that can connect a consumer with a network of customer service representatives. So this is an example of a middleman. Another example is Amazon's Home Services gives consumers a network of providers of specialized services. Trying to think of some others. I mean, the Uber app is basically an example of a middleman. There's an app called Roadie that a friend of mine works for this company, and they provide delivery services on demand. So this is another example of middleman. But there's lots of middlemen currently, especially given how much the internet and smartphone and devices has grown in recent years. Okay, so that was chapter 4. Just real quick, let's go over a summary of the learning objectives. So in section 1, we talked about the essential features of a price system or market system, where prices are allowed to respond to changes in supply and demand, and prices act as signals. They're communicated in the market, and they tend to help minimize transaction costs. In section 2, we talked about the effects of changes in demand and supply on market price and equilibrium quantity. So this one's really important. This is a very important section that you need to be very aware of. So increases in demand increase equilibrium price and quantity, and decreases in demand decrease equilibrium price and quantity, whereas increases in supply decrease market price but increase quantity, and vice versa for decreases in supply. So make sure you go over this section particularly well and become very familiar with it. Probably the most important part of this chapter, followed by price controls. We also looked at, in section 2, the effects of changes in demand and supply when both of them shift at the same time, right? So we saw that when both supply and demand shift simultaneously, the outcome will be indeterminate for either price or quantity. So make sure you're familiar with that too. In section 3, we talked very quickly about the rationing function of prices and some other non-price ways of rationing. In section 4, we looked at price ceilings, right, which are maximum prices that only matter when they are set below equilibrium price. And we saw how they can lead to non-price rationing devices in black markets. And then in section 5, we talked about price floors or minimum prices and government-imposed quantity restrictions. So bans on sales or ownership, licensing restrictions, and import quotas are the quantity restrictions there. And we saw how these lead to surpluses. All right, that concludes chapter 4. I'll see you in the next video for Appendix B.